New old nuclear threats. Putin is once again trying to scare the world with the Burevestnik, claiming that it is a superweapon capable of flying as far as it wants, wherever it wants, and carrying nuclear warheads. But America has not stood aside. Trump immediately responded, American submarines are already lurking off the coast of Russia and are ready to strike at any moment. So what happens next, and where are we headed? Toward nuclear escalation or perhaps a third world war, which this time would be a nuclear war? Or maybe these are just more scare tactics from the Kremlin, aimed at the domestic audience or the West. We'll be figuring all this out further. Hello, my name is Anastasia Husarieva. Thank you for being with us. And while you're liking this video, which I really hope you are, subscribing to our channel and leaving comments, I'll tell you everything you need to know about this topic. So in the United States, they've concluded that Moscow is not planning any real peace with Ukraine. This was reported to members of Congress. They were shown an intelligence briefing note. It states directly, Russia is not ready for either a ceasefire or any serious agreements. And even with all this, Donald Trump's attempts to initiate negotiations with Putin have not changed anything so far. Putin continues to apply pressure, even though he has lost many people and much money in this war, and convinces himself and others that these losses were not in vain. Last week, Trump canceled the meeting with Putin that had been discussed for so long and was supposed to take place in the Hungarian capital, Budapest, and for the first time in his second term imposed major sanctions against the two largest Russian oil companies. He says the sanctions are serious, but he wants them to help stop the war and reach a deal. So far, despite these sanctions, the Kremlin is not only refusing to negotiate, they are not even planning to come to the negotiating table. European diplomats and former American intelligence officers say that pressure and new sanctions could change this situation, but so far there has been no result. This summer, Ukraine and Russia have already held several rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, and Putin met with Donald Trump in Alaska. Next, Volodymyr Zelensky met with Donald Trump at the White House. The only agreement reached was on the exchange of prisoners of war, if we are talking about the negotiations in Istanbul. The US and Ukraine proposed direct talks at the leaders' level, but Putin avoided them, saying that Zelensky could only come to Moscow. Zelensky and his team are clear. Ukraine is ready to meet with Putin anywhere in the world, whether in Sydney or Rio, just not in Russia or Belarus, for obvious reasons. But Putin refuses because he is afraid of negotiations. In the 1960s, the US and the USSR tried to develop cruise missiles with nuclear engines, but quickly abandoned the idea due to radioactive contamination. Russia returned to this concept in the 2000s, when the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Mykola Sokolov, a leading researcher at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, says, "It is very difficult to build an engine without serious radioactive emissions." But apparently, Rosatom managed to reduce the emissions to a minimum because in 2018, Russia announced that it had created such a missile. It was named Burevestnik, and in the West, it has already been dubbed the Flying Chernobyl. Pavel Podvig, the head of the Russian nuclear weapons project, adds that during tests, the missile can simply fall into the sea, and then special teams have to retrieve them. They dive in, search for the wreckage, because inside is a nuclear engine that needs to be recovered so as not to leave radioactive materials in the water. This is extremely dangerous work because any damage to the reactor can cause a radiation leak or even an explosion. That's exactly what happened in 2019 at the Neonoxa test site near Arkhangelsk. At that time, Russian specialists were trying to recover fragments of the Burevestnik from the sea after yet another failed launch. But during this operation, an explosion did occur. Several people were killed, and dozens more were exposed to radiation. A radioactive cloud covered the nearby city of Severodvinsk, and some of the radiation even reached Norway. So why does Russia need this missile? According to Russian propaganda, the Burevestnik has two main advantages: an almost unlimited flight range and the ability to attack from any direction, bypassing missile defense systems, even those of the United States of America. In other words, theoretically, even if the US had an iron dome like Israel, the Burevestnik could fly around it and strike from anywhere. But in reality, it's not as frightening as it sounds, and not all of these scare tactics reflect the truth. The missile doesn't fly very fast, just a few hundred kilometers per hour, so it can be shot down by regular air defense systems or even by fighter jets. It's indeed hard to detect due to its low flight path and maneuvers, but no one in the world considers it a superweapon with no countermeasures. And here it's worth adding that in October of this year, the Russians already tried to test that same Burevestnik. They claimed that the missile flew 14,000 kilometers in 15 hours. Their general staff boasted that it was a successful test and that infrastructure for the new weapon was being prepared. It's also worth noting that the launch of this Burevestnik was confirmed by the Norwegians. Blogger and their intelligence said that the missile was launched from the Arctic archipelago of Novaya Zemlya in the Barents Sea. According to dictator Putin, the Burevestnik is a very complex thing that can fly wherever it wants for as long as it wants, bypassing any missile defense system. In other words, the Kremlin presents it as a weapon of the future that supposedly changes the rules of the game. But experts in the West no longer believe Putin's propaganda, and they are quite skeptical. Strategically, this missile gives Moscow nothing, and the technology itself is dangerous. If the engine picks something up, the world could face a new radiation disaster right over the Arctic Ocean. Moreover, American intelligence has recorded at least 12 tests of this very same Burevestnik. Since 2016, only one test is considered successful, which the Russians conducted in 2017. And after all these horrors, after everything that happened, the President of the United States of America reminded everyone that they have the best nuclear submarine in the world, which is already stationed near the Russian shores. And he hinted that America is also ready to show its strength if the Kremlin starts playing with nuclear weapons. Blogger. Trump also advised Putin that instead of showing off miracle weapons, it would be better to end the war in Ukraine, noting that the conflict should have lasted a week. But in reality, it has already been going on for the fourth year. Well, it all started when the former president of the aggressor country, Dmitry Medvedev, also in his usual nuclear style, hinted that they have a Soviet system called Dead Hand, which automatically launches missiles if the Russian leadership is killed. And back then, he also advised Trump to watch movies about The Walking Dead. And so, in response to these threats, the United States of America sent submarines. On August 1st, Trump stated that due to Medvedev's extremely provocative statements, he sent 2 nuclear submarines in response to the appropriate regions. And this is not a drill or a military operation. This is a political signal, which was demonstrated to Russia as a show of force. And when the former president of Russia and the current president of the United States were exchanging such signals, the stakes, of course, rose. In turn, Donald Trump is showing that America will not allow Moscow to play with nuclear weapons, even if this game is only in words. Blogger. And if anyone thinks that the current nuclear threats from the Kremlin are something new, they're not. Putin has been speaking with the same words, the same tone, and the same threats for a long time now. Back in October 2023, he once again showcased his Burevestnik, which Russian propaganda calls a weapon without limits. At that time, Putin stated that Russia had conducted a successful missile test and that the intercontinental Sarmat system was also almost ready. In other words, he wanted to send the following message: we have something to scare the world with. But in the West, this latest bravado from the Kremlin was immediately met with skepticism. The New York Times wrote that satellites and intelligence indicate Russia is indeed preparing the Burevestnik after 13 previous attempts between 2017 and 2019. And all of them were unsuccessful, as we discussed earlier. And again, as was mentioned before this, the missile explosion in 2019. At that time, several people died and dozens more were exposed to radiation. So, when Putin once again brandishes something like the Burevestnik and talks about his missiles, we should remember it's the same rhetoric, the same threats, the same so-called successful tests, in quotation marks. There is no real threat for now. At least that's how it is seen in the West. Blogger, and as American journalist Bob Woodward wrote in his book War, whom I will also show you now, when the Ukrainian armed forces were driving Russian occupiers out of the Kherson region and could have inflicted irreparable losses on the Russian army, Washington intervened. The Americans convinced Kyiv to let the Russians withdraw peacefully because they were afraid of nuclear escalation. Supposedly, there was even direct contact between the American military and Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff of the occupying country, Russia. He warned that if the Russians suffered heavy losses during the retreat, Russia would use nuclear weapons. And after that, the White House decided it was better to let Moscow withdraw its troops peacefully. So unfortunately, the armed forces of Ukraine did not get the green light, and more than 30,000 occupiers, along with all of Russia's equipment, withdrew without any problems to the left bank of the Kherson region. In fact, at that time, the US suffered, or rather provided Moscow with a so-called security corridor to avoid the risk of a nuclear strike. And it was precisely this that broke the chance for a quick end to the war at the end of 2022, or at least the probable chance. And when the story became public at the beginning of 2025, Washington decided not to comment on these details. But reading between the lines, it's clear that the main thing is that the decision was made not for the sake of victory, but out of fear of that very nuclear button. Blogger. But let's get back to the Burevestnik. While Russia boasts about its nuclear cruise missile, which supposedly can fly anywhere, and bypass all missile defense systems, American experts say this missile is a dangerous and almost uncontrollable toy for demonstrating power, not a truly invincible weapon. Former commander of the American Navy SEAL Squadron, Chuck Farrer, explains that the Burevestnik is essentially a revived old idea from the American SLAM project of the 1950s. At that time, the United States of America was trying to create a supersonic missile that would fly at low altitude and be equipped with a nuclear ramjet engine. The idea was that a nuclear reactor would heat the air, which would then propel the missile forward and allow it to fly very, very far. But there were countless problems at the time. The engine would overheat and the electronics would fail. Neutron radiation destroyed the materials. And worst of all, the missile released radioactive elements into the air. And these are dangerous both for nature and for people. Because of this, the project in the United States was shut down back in 1964. Americans say that the Burevestnik is not an invincible missile, but a dangerous doomsday theater. The design is unstable and dangerous. Continuing the tests could cause ecological disasters, violate nuclear treaties, and threaten the lives of people and marine ecosystems. But despite all this, Putin and his top general Gerasimov have once again put on a show around the Burevestnik. At the parade, they boasted that the missile can fly 14,000 kilometers, stayed in the air for 15 hours, bypassed missile defense systems, and can hit any protected targets. Putin, of course, picked up on this information and emphasized that this is a unique weapon that no one else in the world has and ordered it to be prepared for serial deployment. But amid all this boasting, there were already plenty of those very same buts mentioned: the nuclear engine operation, a dozen failed tests, a radiation disaster, and that so-called guaranteed accuracy in bypassing missile defense, which the Kremlin talks about so much. Experts are casting doubt on. The engine and design still pose risks to people and the environment. It should be added here that 60 years ago, the world was already on the brink of destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis of '62, when the missiles in Cuba almost triggered a nuclear apocalypse. Back then, it ended and calmed down literally by a miracle. But today, history is repeating itself, albeit in a new, harsher form. Putin boasts about the Burevestnik, which, according to him, can fly around half the planet. Trump responds with nuclear submarines near the Russian shores. And both are turning fear into a political weapon. It should also be noted here that there will be no winners in this game. There is only a line beyond which nuclear silence begins. And all the leaders in the world need to remember this. And you, please share your thoughts on whether the Burevestnik is really as terrifying as it's portrayed, or how far we are from this escalation and what might happen next. We'd be happy to read them. And don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and we'll see you in the next broadcast. My name is Anastasia Husareva. Take care of yourselves and wash your hands with soap. Bye-bye, everyone.